So picture this. Imagine you are an elder in a civilization that has just functioned perfectly for centuries.
Right. A totally stable society.
Exactly. I mean, your laws, your wisdom, your system of justice, all of it is held together by this bedrock elder system.
Yeah, you know who you are, you know how the universe works, and you know your exact place within it.
Yes. And then, out of nowhere, a man with pink skin arrives in what they call a metal box on wheels.
A motor car, right?
Right, a car. And he points at just some random local teenager who happens to have learned his foreign language, and he announces to your entire community, this boy is now your supreme ruler.
It's honestly difficult to even process the scale of that psychological shock. I mean, it's not just a change in management, you know.
No, it is the total invalidation of your reality. And that story, it's actually recounted by Chief Kabongo of the Kikuyu people.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, he described the arrival of the very first European colonizer, whom he called a pink cheek, arriving in a box on wheels. And this pink cheek unilaterally decides that a young man named Moon, who wasn't even an elder, by the way, would now be the chief.
Just because he learned the language.
Literally just because of that. He told the elders he will be your mouth and our mouth. And Chief Kabongo described looking at the other elders in just pure bewilderment.
I can't even imagine.
He asked, was this the end of everything that we had known and worked for? He called it a thunderbolt falling among them.
A thunderbolt. That's a powerful way to put it.
It really is. In a single second, your entire history, your entire conceptual framework is declared completely obsolete by a complete outsider.
And, well, the devastating part is that the outsider doesn't even comprehend the intricate society they're dismantling.
Right. They have no idea.
They aren't replacing it with something better. They're simply erasing it because it doesn't look like what they are used to.
Yeah.
It is the absolute definition of a paradigm-destroying shock.
And that profound trauma, that intellectual and cultural rupture, is really the beating heart of our deep dive today.
It really is.
We aren't looking at history as this smooth, continuous line of cause and effect. We are looking at a historical landscape defined by a massive, violent earthquake.
So what's our source material for this?
Right. So our source material today is an anthology. It's titled African Philosophy, The Essential Readings. It was edited by Tsenay Serequeberhan and published back in 1991.
Which was a very specific, deliberate moment in the academic world.
Oh, definitely.
Yeah, this anthology was part of the Paragon Issues and Philosophy series. And, prior to the late 80s and early 90s, if you took an undergraduate philosophy course almost anywhere in the Western world...
You were reading the same five guys.
Exactly. You were being force-fed a very narrow, exclusively Eurocentric curriculum.
Yeah, just totally boxed in.
Right. So the Paragon series was designed as a direct intervention. It was built to bring marginalized philosophical currents like feminist philosophy, philosophy of sport, and ethnic philosophies out of the academic shadows.
And put them right in front of university students.
Yeah.
So it was really a challenge to the establishment saying, hey, the philosophical universe is much larger than Plato and Descartes.
Precisely. It was a demand for oxygen in a room that had been sealed off for centuries.
I love that. So for you listening right now, I want to be clear that this is not a dry, dusty history lesson.
No, not at all.
We are wading into an intense, high-stakes intellectual battleground. I mean, the stakes are literally the definition of humanity.
Yeah, who gets to be considered human?
Exactly. Okay, let's unpack this. We are going to explore how an entire continent, after being systematically erased from the history of human thought by Western thinkers, fought to reclaim its intellectual identity.
And it wasn't a smooth process either.
No, not at all. We'll examine the fierce, sometimes really bitter internal debates among African scholars over what that new identity should actually look like. Because rebuilding a shattered reality is not a peaceful process.
It's a debate about survival, about identity, and ultimately, who gets to define what truth actually is.
Exactly. Now, before we really get into it, I just want to remind you, the listener, that we're neutrally exploring the author's historical critique here.
Right, we're not taking political sides.
Exactly. We're just impartially reporting on the content provided in the text and highlighting how it frames Western philosophy. We aren't endorsing any specific political viewpoints, just, trying to convey the ideas contained in the original source material.
Makes sense. So to understand the philosophy, we kind of have to start by examining the crime scene, right? Let's go back to the late 19th century.
Yeah, let's set the stage.
We're talking about the period leading up to and following the infamous Berlin Conference of 1884.
Okay, the scramble for Africa.
Yes, the era widely known as the Scramble for Africa.
Right, where European powers literally sat around a map with rulers, like actual rulers, and violently carved up an entire continent into colonies.
Completely ignoring ethnic, linguistic, or historical boundaries, just drawing lines.
Yeah, it's wild to think about.
With the sole exception of Abyssinia, which is modern-day Ethiopia. But what Serequeberhan's text argues so powerfully here is that we cannot view this merely as a political or economic land grab.
Right, because we usually just think of the resources.
Exactly. We tend to think of colonialism in terms of stolen rubber, gold, diamonds, and tragically human labor. But fundamentally, the text argues this was an intellectual and metaphysical conquest.
Okay, hold on. Metaphysical conquest. Break that down for me. How do you, conquer someone metaphysically?
Think about the justification you'd need to subjugate an entire continent. European colonialism didn't just operate on the cynical, pirate-like premise of, we have bigger guns, so we are taking your stuff.
I mean, if they had just said that, it would have been brutal, but at least honest.
Right, exactly. But instead, it operated under a deeply ingrained, almost religious delusion that Europe was spreading civilization and light to the dark, backward corners of the globe. They really believed they were the designated carriers of universal human progress. They were defining the nature of reality, the metaphysics, for the people they conquered.
So they weren't just stealing the land, they were telling the people living there that their version of reality was fundamentally incorrect.
Yes, your reality is wrong, ours is right.
The text gives a brutal example of this mindset. It quotes Rudyard Kipling's very famous poem, The White Man's Burden.
Oh yeah, that one.
It's one of those phrases that floats around in pop culture, but when you actually read the specific words, it is chilling. Kipling explicitly describes colonized peoples as new-caught sullen peoples, half devil and half child.
Half devil and half child.
Yeah.
It is just the perfect distillation of the colonizer's paradox.
What do you mean by paradox there?
Well, you have to frame the colonized subject as two things simultaneously to justify what you're doing. First, they have to be a savage, dangerous threat that needs to be forcefully subdued.
That's the devil part.
Right. But second, they are infantile, helpless creatures incapable of self-governance who need to be paternalistically guided by the West.
And that's the child part.
Exactly.
So by framing it that way, the European isn't an invader. The European is a savior taking on a heavy, exhausting, thankless burden.
Like they're doing them a favor.
Right. They're practically martyrs for the cause of human development.
It completely inverts the morality of the situation. And, if it were just a poet or a few rogue politicians saying this, we could maybe brush it off as just the literary racism of the era.
Sure.
But the text highlights something far more insidious. It highlights the shocking complicity of Western philosophy's absolute greatest minds.
This is the part that blew my mind.
The giants, right. The people whose names are carved into the limestone of university libraries worldwide. They weren't just casually prejudiced. Their racism was load-bearing.
Load-bearing. Wow.
It was structural to their philosophical systems.
This is where my jaw was legitimately on the floor reading the source material. Let's start with David Hume.
Okay, yeah. David Hume is one of the most important empiricist philosophers of the Scottish Enlightenment.
Empiricist meaning he believes knowledge comes from sensory experience and observation, right? Like you have to see the evidence.
Correct. An empiricist demands hard data. You don't just deduce things from the armchair, you observe the world.
Right, you need proof.
Yet in his writings, Hume explicitly stated that he suspected Negroes to be naturally inferior to whites.
Based on what?
He confidently claimed there was never a civilized nation of any complexion other than white. He completely erased any possibility of African intellectual achievement.
But wait, did he ever travel to Africa? Did he actually observe these complex African societies?
No, never. And that is the staggering hypocrisy of his position. The great champion of empirical observation completely abandoned his own rigorous methodology when it came to people of color.
He just threw it out the window.
He just accepted the racist folklore of his time as unassailable fact.
It's infuriating. But then we get to Immanuel Kant, and it somehow gets worse.
Yeah, Kant is a tough one.
Kant is the father of modern ethics. He's the guy who wrote about the categorical imperative, the whole idea that you must act according to rules that could become universal laws.
Right.
He's the one who said we must treat humanity as an end in itself, never merely as a means to an end.
Yes. Kant defined the Enlightenment as man's emergence from his self-incurred immaturity. He is the towering figure of moral philosophy.
Yet the text quotes a moment that is just genuinely difficult to read. Kant is recounting a statement made by an African man, and instead of analyzing the man's argument, which is what a philosopher is supposed to do.
So is their literal job, yeah?
Right. Instead of that, Kant dismisses it entirely by saying, this fellow was quite black from head to foot, a clear proof that what he said was stupid.
It is breathtaking in its bluntness.
It's just wild.
For Kant, the physical trait of blackness was a priori evidence of an absence of reason.
Let's clarify that term for a second, a priori.
Sure. A priori means knowledge that is independent of experience. It's something you know is true just by definition without needing to investigate.
Yeah. Like knowing a triangle has three sides.
Yeah, exactly. You don't need to go out and look at every triangle in the world to prove it.
Yeah.
So Kant is essentially arguing that a black person's lack of intelligence is a mathematical certainty.
True by definition.
Right, requiring absolutely no investigation.
So the man who preached that we must treat all humanity as an end in itself simply drew a circle around the word humanity and explicitly left Africans outside of it.
Yes.
It's a massive loophole in his universal ethics.
And we really must understand how foundational Kant is. He isn't a fringe thinker. When he defined man and reason, he built the conceptual architecture that the modern Western world still lives in.
And he deliberately excluded an entire continent from that architecture.
He did.
Which brings us to G.W.F. Hegel. I feel like Hegel is kind of the final boss of this specific intellectual trauma.
Hegel is arguably the most crucial figure here because his philosophy is entirely about history. Hegel's system is based on the dialectical unfolding of spirit or reason in the world.
Let's translate that a bit. Unfolding of spirit. He doesn't mean like a ghost, right?
No. By spirit or Geist, Hegel means something like collective human consciousness or the drive toward ultimate freedom and self-awareness.
Okay, so it's bigger than any one person.
Right. For Hegel, history isn't just a random sequence of events. History is a purposeful march forward. It's the story of humanity slowly waking up, realizing it is free, and building institutions that reflect that freedom.
Okay, I mean, that sounds rather beautiful, a progressive arc to the moral universe. So where does Africa fit into Hegel's grand historical unfolding?
It doesn't.
It doesn't.
At all. In his philosophy of history, Hegel categorically declares that Africa has no historical part of the world.
Wow.
He states it has no movement or development to exhibit. For Hegel, Africa is the land of childhood, lying completely beyond the day of self-conscious history, enveloped in the dark mantle of night.
The dark mantle of night. So they aren't just behind on the time, they aren't even on the timeline.
Precisely. And this wasn't an accidental oversight either. Hegel's philosophical system actually required an ahistorical Africa.
Wait, why did he need that?
Well, if European history is the pinnacle of the unfolding spirit, the ultimate manifestation of freedom and rationality, then he needed a contrast. He needed a before picture.
Oh, I see.
Africa was conceptually flattened into a state of primitive, instinctual nature to serve as the dark background against which European civilization could shine so brightly.
He used an entire continent as a philosophical prop.
Yes, exactly.
And the text points out something that completely upended my understanding of this era. You might expect this kind of justification from the capitalist imperialist thinkers, but even Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels.
Yes, the great radical critics of European capitalism, the champions of the oppressed working class.
Right. I would assume Marx would look at colonialism and say, this is the ultimate evil of capitalist extraction.
You would think so.
But the text notes that Marx and Engels viewed the brutal destruction of African and Asian societies by colonialism as a necessary regenerating step toward global progress.
We have to remember Marx's theory of historical materialism here. Marx believed society evolves through very specific, unavoidable economic stages.
Like a ladder.
Yes. From primitive communism to slave societies to feudalism to capitalism and eventually to socialism and communism.
So it's a fixed ladder you have to climb, no skipping steps.
Exactly. And Marx viewed traditional African and Asian societies as stagnant. He thought they were stuck in primitive or feudal modes of production.
Okay.
So in his deeply Eurocentric view, these societies had to be violently pulled into the global capitalist system by Europe. They had to be conquered, their traditional ways of life completely destroyed, so they could enter the capitalist state.
Because that's the only way forward for them.
Right. Because only after going through the crucible of capitalism could they ever hope to reach the final utopia of communism.
So even the ultimate revolutionary is saying, yes, colonialism is horrific and bloody, but it's the necessary price of admission to global history.
Exactly.
What I find so striking, and what Serequeberhan's anthology highlights so well, is the underlying consensus across all these widely different Western thinkers.
It is the unifying thread of Western philosophy
Yeah.
during this era.
Yeah. You have Hume the empiricist, Kant the moralist, Hegel the idealist, and Marx the materialist. They disagree on almost everything about how the world works, but they share one absolute grounding metaphysical belief. European humanity is synonymous with humanity as such.
European history is universal history.
Therefore, the violent subjugation of Africa wasn't viewed by these thinkers as a crime against humanity. It was philosophically justified as the emancipation of man.
They honestly believed they were bringing the light of reason to a place that had absolutely none.
Let me try an analogy here to capture the sheer audacity of this gaslighting because it's just wild.
Go for it.
Imagine someone violently breaks into your house. They smash all your furniture, they burn your family photo albums, they tear down the structural beams.
Okay, a complete home invasion.
Right. And then, while standing in the smoldering wreckage of your living room, they sit down and write a globally published, universally accepted textbook declaring that you, the homeowner, never possessed any concept of interior design. You didn't even know what a house was. And furthermore, they argue that you should be profoundly grateful to them for clearing out the space because now they can finally teach you how to sit on a chair properly.
That captures the dynamic perfectly because the violence we are talking about isn't just physical violence, it's epistemic violence.
Yeah, epistemic violence, meaning violence against knowledge itself.
Yes, it is the violence of rewriting the victim's reality. It is forcing the subjugated people to accept the perpetrator's version of events as objective truth.
That's horrifying.
The text uses a brilliant term for this: white mythology. The West took its own highly specific regional mythology, its own idioms, its own local ways of thinking, and it slapped a label on them that said universal truth.
And it used that label as a weapon.
A weapon to invalidate every other way of existing on the planet.
And, to be totally clear to you, the listener, our mission here isn't to cancel Kant or Marx or to take a modern political stance on their entire bodies of work.
Right.
We are tracing the intellectual history presented in Serequeberhan's text. We are looking at how Western philosophy, which sold itself as the pure pursuit of objective truth, functioned in reality as the ultimate intellectual justification for colonial conquest.
It provided the moral and logical cover for the scramble for Africa.
Which brings us to a massive existential problem. If African intellectual identity was completely bulldozed by these Western universal truths, how does a continent even begin to rebuild it?
It's a daunting task.
If your entire history, your capacity for reason, has been erased by the global academic establishment, where does modern African philosophy even start? How do you kick open a door that the entire world has locked from the outside?
Well, the deeply uncomfortable irony of this history is that the person who first kicked that door open from the inside wasn't an African philosopher. It was a European colonizer.
Wait, really?
Yeah, and this brings us to a pivotal moment in 1945.
Okay, 1945. World War II is ending. The global order is shifting. What happens?
A Belgian Franciscan missionary named Father Placide Tempels publishes a book called Bantu Philosophy.
Okay.
Tempels had spent years living among the Bantu people in the Belgian Congo, which was at the time one of the most brutally exploited colonies on Earth.
Truly brutal.
And after all this time living closely with the indigenous population, Tempels came to a conclusion that completely defied centuries of European academic consensus.
He went against Kant and Hegel.
He did. He argued that the African was not a half-devil, half-child devoid of consciousness. He argued that the Bantu people did have a philosophy.
Really?
Yes. He claimed they possessed a complex, coherent, and highly conscious worldview based on a dynamic concept of vital force.
What's fascinating here is, let's unpack that. What does he mean by vital force?
Well, in Western ontology, the study of being, we tend to think of things as static. A rock is a rock. A person is a person.
Right. It just is what it is.
But Tempels argued that the Bantu worldview saw the universe as an interconnected web of dynamic energy. Being is force. Everything has a vital force, and these forces can interact, strengthen, or weaken each other.
This sounds really deep.
It's a highly sophisticated, fluid way of understanding existence, morality, and community.
Okay, so Tempels is publishing a book saying, hey, Europe, you are wrong. These people are deeply intellectual, they have a profound ontological system, and we need to respect their humanity.
That's what it sounds like, right?
Yeah, it sounds like an incredible breakthrough, a heroic moment of cross-cultural understanding.
It sounds like it until you investigate his motives. Yeah. Tempels didn't write Bantu Philosophy to champion African independence. He didn't write it to dismantle the colonial system.
Then why write it?
He wrote it as a manual for the colonial administrators.
Are you kidding me?
His explicitly stated goal in the text was to document and expose this Bantu mentality so that European colonizers, administrators, and missionaries could better understand them.
Wait, why did the colonizers need to understand their philosophy if they were already controlling them with guns?
To subjugate them more efficiently.
Wow.
Tempels is essentially saying to the Belgian authorities, our colonial project is encountering resistance because we are treating these people like empty vessels. We keep pouring our ideas into them and wondering why it's not taking root.
Because they aren't empty.
Exactly. They have a highly complex internal operating system. If we want to truly control them, if we want to effectively civilize and Christianize them, we need to understand their code.
Here's where it gets really interesting. That is,
Yeah.
wow, that is incredibly dark.
He is validating their humanity solely for the purpose of weaponizing it against them.
It's like an IT administrator hacking into a company's server. He isn't mapping the network architecture to improve the server. He's mapping it to figure out the exact vulnerability so he can install spyware without triggering the alarms.
That's a great analogy.
He's taking the deepest, most profound spiritual and philosophical beliefs of a people and handing them to the oppressor as an instruction manual for psychological domination.
It is an expropriation of the interiority of the subjugated. I mean, the physical land had already been stolen. Now Tempels was providing the map to steal the mind.
I cannot even fathom the psychological trauma of that realization for African intellectuals at the time. To have your cognitive framework finally acknowledged by the West, finally deemed worthy of the title philosophy, only to realize it's a trap.
It creates a profound ambivalence, a double bind for the emerging class of Western-educated African intellectuals in the mid-20th century. Well, Tempels hands them a sword. On one side of the blade, it's a weapon against Hegelian racism. They can finally point to a globally recognized book and say, look, we do have thought. We are rational beings.
But on the other side
of the blade, the very methodology of documenting this philosophy was tainted by its colonial subjugating intent.
So the question becomes, how do you disarm that weapon? If Tempels use the documentation of your myths to control you, what is your next move?
The immediate reaction by African scholars was to try and take the tool back. This leads to the first major movement in modern African philosophy, a trend that the philosopher Pauline Hanlonji later coined, somewhat critically, as ethnophilosophy.
Ethnophilosophy. So the philosophy of an ethnic group. Who are the key players here?
You had prominent African scholars like Innocent Onyenwere, John Esamidi, and Alexa Kagame.
Yeah.
They looked at Tempels' work and essentially said, the colonial motive is toxic, but the documentation method is powerful. Let's strip away the colonizer's intent and use this method to foster African pride.
What did that actually look like in practice? Like, how do you do ethnophilosophy?
They set out to systematically document the myths, the religious beliefs, the proverbs, the linguistic structures, and the traditional worldviews of specific African ethnic groups.
Okay, getting it all down on paper.
Right. Kagame, for example, did an exhaustive philosophical analysis of the Kinyarwanda language to extract the underlying Bantu worldview. They wanted to prove to the West and to themselves that an ancient, complex, and profound African civilization existed long before the Europeans arrived.
They wanted to codify the collective traditional mind of Africa.
Exactly.
You know, I have to admit, I'm going to play devil's advocate here, because when I was reading this part of the source material and the text starts laying out the heavy criticism of ethnophilosophy, my immediate reaction was, but wait, isn't that exactly what they should be doing?
How do you mean?
Well, if your culture, your history, your entire conceptual framework was violently erased and belittled for a century, isn't step one of recovery just writing it all down? Isn't it crucial to build an archive? To prove to the world we are here, our roots are deep, and our ancestors were profound thinkers? Why is the text so critical of African scholars trying to reclaim their own heritage?
It's a very natural reaction. And it's important to note that the text does acknowledge the edifying, positive role that ethnophilosophy played initially.
It did some good then.
It restored a measure of dignity. It was a necessary first step. But the fierce criticism from the next generation of African philosophers stems from what ethnophilosophy actually accomplishes in the present moment.
Which is what?
Not much, according to its critics. The critique is that documenting old myths and static worldviews doesn't solve modern crises.
Oh, I see.
It traps African philosophy in the past. It reduces the discipline of philosophy, which is supposed to be dynamic and critical, to mere cultural anthropology. You aren't doing philosophy. You are just curating a museum exhibit of your ancestors.
You're dusting off the artifacts instead of forging new tools.
Exactly. To illustrate the urgency of this critique, Serequeberhan brings in a devastatingly powerful quote from Frantz Fanon.
Frantz Fanon is a massive figure. Can we give the listener a quick grounding on who he was?
Sure. Fanon was a Martinican psychiatrist, philosopher, and revolutionary who became deeply involved in the Algerian War of Independence against France.
So he was in the thick of it.
He wrote extensively on the deep psychological trauma of colonialism. He was someone who saw the visceral, bleeding reality of colonial violence every single day. He had absolutely no patience for abstract academic exercises that didn't help the oppressed.
And what does Fanon say about this urge to dig up the ancient past?
Fanon is writing about this exact phenomenon of intellectuals trying to validate the present by proving the greatness of the ancient past. He writes that he would be absolutely thrilled to discover a correspondence between an ancient Negro philosopher and Plato. He'd love to know that 3,000 years ago, an African thinker was debating the nature of reality with the Greeks. But, Fanon says, he absolutely cannot see how discovering that fact changes anything in the lives of the 8-year-old children laboring in the cane fields today.
Wow. That hits incredibly hard.
It really puts things in perspective.
Fanon is looking at the African intellectual and saying, great, you wrote a book proving your tribe had a complex cosmology in the year 1200. Does that stop the colonizer's whip from striking a child's back today?
Exactly.
Does your linguistic analysis of ancient proverbs feed the starving? Does it offer a political strategy for independence?
It's a harsh, incredibly sobering demand for relevance. Fanon is pointing out the trap of nostalgia. Nostalgia feels good. It provides comfort.
It doesn't change reality.
Right. If those ancient proverbs don't give you the critical tools to analyze and survive the brutal neo-colonial economic system you are currently trapped in, is it actually useful as philosophy? Or is it an academic comfort blanket that distracts you from the burning building you are standing in?
And beyond the lack of practical utility, isn't there a deeper philosophical flaw with ethnophilosophy? By saying, this is the philosophy of the Bantu people, you are treating an entire ethnic group as if they all share one single unchanging brain.
That is the exact critique leveled by the next wave of philosophers.
Yeah.
By merely documenting the collective instinctual beliefs of a tribe, ethnophilosophy inadvertently agrees with the racist Western assumption that Africans think as a collective mass, rather than as individual critical thinkers.
Wow, that's a huge backfire.
It inadvertently confirms the stereotype that Africans operate on myth and emotion, rather than critical reason.
Because in the West, philosophy is driven by individuals. Descartes says, I think, therefore I am, not the French think, therefore we are.
Precisely. And because of this perceived failure, this idea that ethnophilosophy was staring backward while the continent was in crisis and inadvertently confirming European stereotypes, a fierce opposing camp arose in the academic ranks to tear ethnophilosophy down.
Which brings us to a massive clash within the universities. The battle between the universalists and the proponents of philosophic sagacity.
Yes, a huge debate.
Let's start with the universalists. Who are they and what is their argument?
The universalists, sometimes called the professional or scientistic trend, were championed by heavy-hitting African scholars trained heavily in Western analytic traditions, people like Kwasi Wiredu, Pauline Huntanji, and Peter Boudunrin.
And their reaction against ethnophilosophy was what?
It was total and merciless.
Oh, they weren't looking for a compromise?
Not at all. They argued that philosophy is a rigorous, critical, analytical, and scientific discipline. Period. It is not religion. It is not mythology. It is not an uncritical collection of folklore and proverbs.
So they wanted to draw a very hard exclusionary line around the word philosophy.
Yes. They argued that African philosophy shouldn't be defined by its unique African content. It shouldn't be about African gods or traditional dances.
Then what makes it African?
To them, African philosophy is simply universal, rigorous philosophy that happens to be conducted by people who live in Africa. They believed that if African philosophers wanted to be taken seriously on the world stage, they had to abandon the myths and adopt the exact same critical analytical methods used in the universities of London, Paris, and New York.
Wait, slow down. I have a major problem with this universalist position.
Let's hear it.
If I am an African scholar in the 1970s and I look at what the universalists are demanding, it feels like they are walking right into a trap.
Okay, how so?
Well, the colonizer breaks in, destroys everything, and says, the only valid way to think is my way, scientific, analytical, Western. Ethnophilosophy tries to push back and say, no, our indigenous oral myths are valid too. But these universalists are saying, actually, the colonizer's right about how to think. We just need to prove we can do Western-style philosophy as well as they can.
Right.
Aren't they implicitly agreeing with Kant and Hegel that indigenous oral thought isn't real thought?
You have hit on the exact vulnerability of the universalist position.
It feels like they are trying to win a rigged game by agreeing to the rigged rules. They are so desperate not to be seen as primitive that they are willing to throw out their entire cultural heritage to prove they can do symbolic logic like a European.
It is a brilliant critique, and it is shared by many within the text. The universalists were so terrified of the museum exhibit trap of ethnophilosophy that they risked creating a philosophy that was completely disconnected from the actual cultural soil of Africa.
Like they were just copying the West.
They risked becoming purely Western philosophers who merely had African mailing addresses.
So we have an incredibly polarized debate. On one side, ethnophilosophy is looking purely at the past, documenting collective myths and ignoring the critical needs of the present.
Right.
On the other side, the universalists are looking purely at Western scientific methods, demanding extreme academic rigor, but completely ignoring the indigenous culture. It feels like an impossible binary. Does anyone try to bridge this gap? Is there a middle ground?
Yes, and this is one of the most fascinating developments in the anthology. The attempt to bridge this gap comes from the Kenyan philosopher Henry Odera Oruka with his concept of philosophic sagacity.
Philosophic sagacity. Okay, Oruka recognizes the problem. How does he try to solve it?
Oruka wanted to achieve two things simultaneously. First, he wanted to prove that rigorous, critical philosophical reasoning, the kind the universalists demanded, existed in Africa before and independent of Western influence.
So they didn't need Europe to teach them how to think critically?
Exactly. He wanted to prove that reason was not imported on European ships. But second, he didn't want to just catalog tribal myths like the ethno-philosophers. He wanted to find individual critical thinkers within the oral tradition.
How do you find an individual philosopher in a tradition that didn't write books?
You go out and talk to the sages. But Oruka makes a vital, crucial distinction here between what he calls a folk sage and a philosophic sage.
What's the difference?
A folk sage is an elder who is highly respected because they know all the traditions, all the myths, all the rules of the community.
Like a living library.
Yes, but they never question them.
Yeah.
If you ask a folk sage why the tribe performs a certain ritual, they will say, because our ancestors did it and the gods demand it. They are a repository of collective memory. They're exactly what the ethnophilosophers were documenting.
Okay, so what is a philosophic sage?
A philosophic sage is an individual within that same traditional non-literate society who critically engages with their own tradition.
Oh, interesting.
They don't just memorize, they evaluate.
Yeah.
They observe the world rationally, and they might even dissent from the popular tribal belief based on their own independent logic.
Oh, I love this. So give me a hypothetical of how a philosophic sage operates.
Let's say the tribe believes that a prolonged drought is caused by a failure to perform a specific dance to appease a specific deity.
Okay.
The folk sage will insist the tribe must dance harder. But the philosophic sage, who is fully integrated into the tribe, not a Western-educated outsider, might sit back and observe.
What would they say?
They might say, I've watched the seasons for 60 years. I've noticed that regardless of whether we dance or not, the rains only fail when the wind blows continuously from the east for 3 moons. Perhaps the drought is a natural occurrence of the wind, not a punishment from the deity.
That is incredible. They are using independent, rational critique and empirical observation within an oral tradition. They are doing philosophy.
Exactly. Yeah. Oruka actually conducted extensive field work. He traveled to rural areas in Kenya, sitting under trees with these elders, and he rigorously interviewed them.
So he actually found them.
He did. He didn't just ask them what their tribe believed about God, death, or morality. He challenged them. He asked them why they personally believed it.
And what did he find?
He documented instances where these sages explicitly disagreed with the prevailing dogma of their own people, providing rational arguments for their dissent.
He went out and empirically proved that the individual thinker, the rational critic, existed organically in Africa.
He proved that the reason Kant and Hegel claimed was exclusively European is, in fact, a human universal. Critical thought does not require a printing press.
That is such an elegant, powerful solution. It validates the indigenous culture, but elevates it from static myth to dynamic critical thought.
It is a vital intervention. However, as brilliant as Uruka's fieldwork was, for Tsenay Serequeberhan, the editor of our anthology, even this fascinating debate between the universalists and Uruka's sagacity ultimately misses the most urgent bleeding point of the African condition.
Really. Even proving that traditional African societies had individual critical philosophers isn't enough.
It's important history, but Serequeberhan argues it doesn't solve the crisis of the present.
Yeah.
And this takes us to the core argument of the book, the historico-hermeneutical mission.
The historico-hermeneutical mission. That is a heavy, dense academic phrase. Let's translate it. What does Serequeberhan actually want African philosophy to do?
Serequeberhan is advocating for a specific intellectual trend supported by thinkers like Marcion Toa, Iwamba Diawamba, and Okonda Okolo. Let's start with the word hermeneutics.
Okay.
In academic terms, hermeneutics is the theory and methodology of interpretation. Usually it applies to interpreting ancient texts, like the Bible.
Right, figuring out what a text actually means in context.
But here, the text they are trying to interpret isn't a book. The text is the lived, messy, agonizing reality of the contemporary African continent. The historico-hermeneutical approach argues that African philosophy cannot afford to be just an abstract academic exercise.
It has to do something.
It can't just be about documenting sages in rural villages or arguing over scientific methods in university faculty lounges.
Because the reality on the ground is still defined by that massive rupture we talked about at the very beginning with Chief Kabongo.
Precisely. Serequeberhan draws heavily on a concept developed by the cultural critic Edward Said to describe the devastating aftermath of colonialism. Said noted that colonialism didn't just leave behind borders, it created a series of little Europes across Africa and Asia.
Little Europes. What does that mean in practice? What does a little Europe look like?
It means that post-colonial African society is deeply structurally fractured. Think about the physical layout of many post-colonial cities. You have a central, modern urban core that looks like a European capital: banks, universities, paved roads, government buildings. That's the little Europe.
Okay. And who lives there?
The Europeanized African elites.
The people who are educated in Western systems, who speak French or English fluently, who hold the political and economic power.
Yes. But the tragedy is that these elites are physically and culturally disinherited. They are alienated from their own roots. Because the global economic system still demands it, they are forced to mimic the colonizers just to maintain their power and status.
That's a brutal position to be in.
They enforce Western legal codes, they trade in Western currencies, they teach Western curricula.
This is exactly Monet from our opening story, fast-forwarded 100 years. He's the local boy who learned the language of the pink cheek, and now he is wearing the pink cheek's clothes, living in the pink cheek's house, and ruling his own people using the pink cheek's rules.
That is a perfect connection.
Yeah.
The elite are trapped in mimicry. But what about the rest of the country? Outside the little Europe, you have the vast majority of the indigenous, non-Europeanized population living in the rural areas or the massive urban slums.
The people who didn't get assimilated.
Right. But we cannot romanticize their situation either. Their culture isn't pristine or untouched. Because of the sheer trauma of the colonial conquest, their cultural development was stopped dead in its tracks.
It was frozen.
It was petrified.
Yep.
It stagnated because it was actively suppressed and impoverished for a century.
So you have a profoundly broken society. You have an alienated, mimicking elite ruling over a paralyzed, impoverished indigenous majority. Both groups are trapped in a reality designed by the departed colonizer.
Exactly. This is what Serequeberhan calls the broken heritage. And this raises the ultimate question of the text. How on earth do you philosophize in the middle of a broken heritage?
Yeah, where do you even start?
When the past is petrified and the present is just a mimicry of Europe, what is the philosopher supposed to actually do?
If they aren't just supposed to write papers analyzing Hegel, what is their job description?
The text provides a chillingly clear, militant answer. It states that in today's Africa, to think is increasingly to think for or against imperialism.
Wow. Let me just pause on that phrase. To think is increasingly to think for or against imperialism. There is no neutral ground. You cannot just be an objective observer.
None. Because the very structure of your society, the university you teach in, the language you write your papers in, is defined by that imperial history. If you are just doing abstract logic puzzles in the university, you are implicitly supporting the status quo.
You're complicit.
Therefore, for this hermeneutical camp, true African philosophy must be an active political tool.
Its goal isn't just to understand the world, but to change it.
To overcome the wretched condition and the concrete material misery of the continent. The philosopher's job is to analyze the structures of the little Europes and figure out how to dismantle them. Their job is to forge a genuine, autonomous African future that doesn't rely on European mimicry or ancient nostalgia.
Let me bring all these threads together because the arc of this debate is just staggering. It means that for these modern thinkers, true African philosophy cannot be ethnophilosophy. It's not just nostalgically writing down old myths to feel better about the past while the present burns.
Right.
And it's not the universalist approach, blindly copying Western scientific models just to impress European academics and secure tenure.
It is the active, lived political struggle to figure out how to be free in a world that was quite literally built on your historical erasure. It is philosophy as a weapon of emancipation.
And nothing symbolizes that militant commitment more than the dedication at the beginning of this anthology. When Tsenay Serequeberhan published this dense, complex academic philosophy book, he didn't dedicate it to a university, he didn't dedicate it to a famous professor, he dedicated it to the Eritrean People's Liberation Front.
A guerrilla army fighting a brutal war for independence.
Exactly. He explicitly states in the text that for these authors, their intellectual efforts only have meaning in light of the actual endurance, the sacrifice of life and limb of those fighting on the ground for the complete emancipation of the African continent. If your philosophy doesn't serve the liberation of the people, it is useless noise.
It completely bridges the gap between the ivory tower and the trenches. The thought must serve the struggle. The hermeneutic interpretation of the world must lead to the political transformation of the world.
We have been on quite a journey today. We started with the violent epistemic erasure of African history by Enlightenment thinkers like Kant and Hegel, who weaponized reason to justify colonial conquest.
It was a systematic erasure.
We looked at the agonizing paradox of Placide Tempels, the colonizer who validated African thought only to map it for better control. We explored the nostalgic defense mechanism of ethnophilosophy, the rigorous but risky pushback of the universalists trying to play the Western academic game, or Ruka's brilliant fieldwork discovering the individual philosophic sage under the village tree, and finally, the fierce demand that philosophy must be a living, breathing tool for political emancipation in a broken heritage.
It is a profound testament to the resilience of human thought.
Well,
That out of the most systemic intellectual erasure imaginable, a vibrant, fierce, and incredibly nuanced philosophical tradition forged itself.
absolutely.
It didn't just survive the attempt to erase their minds, they built a new framework to understand their reality.
And I want to ask you, the listener, to think about how this applies to your own life. You might be thinking, this is fascinating African history, but what does it have to do with me commuting to work or doing the dishes?
And why should they care?
Well, think about how we consume information in our daily lives. We read articles, we look at economic research, we listen to experts on the news, and we often accept certain things as universal facts. We accept the rules of the game as just the way things are.
Well, we don't question the baseline.
But this deep dive shows us, in the most dramatic way possible, that universal is very often just a label applied by the people who happen to hold the most power.
It is a critical reminder to always interrogate the default settings of our knowledge. When someone presents a concept as objective, universal reason, we must ask, whose reason? And who benefits from us believing it?
Exactly. Which leaves us with a final provocative thought to mull over. If the greatest minds of the Enlightenment, people like Kant and Hume, whose ethics and logic we still teach as the absolute pinnacle of human achievement, if they could successfully package their own regional biases, their blatant racism, and their geopolitical interests as universal reason for centuries, fooling the entire world, what widely accepted universal truths in our global discourse today are actually just the specific cultural myths of modern superpowers.
If we look closely at our own deeply held political and economic beliefs, the things we consider just common sense or objective reality, are we truly thinking for ourselves? Or are we, in our own invisible way, just living in someone else's little Europe?
Are we trusting the societal X-ray machine without realizing the machine itself was built and calibrated to only show certain bones? Are we sitting in the wreckage of our own unexamined assumptions, reading a textbook written by the person who broke in? Think about that the next time someone tells you something is a universal truth. Thanks for taking this deep dive with us.